Right there. Now let's go to our first topic of discussion as we start this week. Nigeria's tax system has undergone significant transformations in recent years, with government implementing various reforms aimed at improving tax compliance, revenue collection, and promote economic growth. One of the most notable developments in Nigeria's tax system is the increased emphasis on technology-driven taxation, with the establishment of Presidential Committee on Fiscal Policy and Tax Reforms. The government hopes to create a more efficient, effective, equitable tax system that can impact on the country's fiscal spending. Well, let's get talking and start the week. I'm being joined by a partner with PricewaterhouseCoopers. She joins me live from Canada, Esiri Agbeye. It's good to see you. Good afternoon, and thank you so much for starting the week with us on Business Nigeria today.
Good afternoon, Tolu. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, it's been a while, and I will say the federal government has been doing a lot, and of course, all around to ease of doing business and to, of course, make the environment better. But the issue of tax that is realized or profits from all foreign exchange transactions of banks in the 2023 financial year is something that has generated comments. Now, this measure is contained in the Finance Bill 2024. But for you, you are the professional in this space. Mine is to ask the question, can you help us understand what this means for financial institutions operating in the country?
Yes. So thanks, Tolu. I think it's a very apt question at the time. And it's actually caused a lot of uproar, both from the banking industry, shareholders or other stakeholders within that space as well. The first thing is it's a windfall tax that is meant to tax the perceived gains that have been made with the fluctuation in the foreign exchange rate against the dollar. And I think from a broader perspective, it may seem okay that, the government is thinking about how to shore up revenues, especially at such a challenging time. But then one has to look a step further and look at more layers to kind of understand what the overall impact may be. What we used to have in the past is, where you had exchange differences, and these exchange differences are coming from, say, you had a loan liability or an intercompany payable that was denominated in dollars. And every year, because of the accounting standards, you had to restate those. So imagine that there was a fluctuation of over 90 or 70%, as we've seen over the past year. Then it means that any receivable or payables that you have that are denominated in dollars automatically become double the amount. But what that also means is for the banks who have lent on these bases, they start to recognize either gains or losses depending on how the needle goes. So for most of the banks, they may be recognizing gains. Now, the second question is, are these real gains? When you have foreign exchange differences, there are two categories. One is those that are coming as a result of translations and those that are coming as a result of conversion of those currencies. When there are conversions, they then become realized because you've actually exchanged cash. Sometimes these exchange differences are coming from translations. So they've only translated those balances in their books at the going rates. And so they are paper gains. What the government is then saying is there is a windfall and we need to tax it. So it raises a lot of questions, a lot of concerns. Are we going to be taxing paper gains or do we want to tax real gains? And why that question is pertinent is at the end of the day, any taxes you pay have an impact on the real cash balance that you have at hand. It also then has an impact on what profits or cash you might distribute to shareholders. It also, in turn, has an impact on what cash is even available to lend. And so when you have a windfall tax that's going to be as high as 70%, there are questions around, one, how is it going to deplete our cash base, our cash reserves? Two, how is it going to affect, the lending that's probably going to be available or should have been available to the real sector? Number three, we have recognized some of the taxes, because there is a concept in accounting that talks about your current tax, which is what you pay right now, and your deferred taxes, which you have to make a provision for under IAS 12 for future transactions. And so what it means is where you have paper gains like that, you may not have to tax it now because the law does not require that you tax it since they're not real gains, but you must make a provision for the future. The provisions that have been made over time have been made at the current tax rate, which is 30%. And so now you come up with a law that doesn't have any transition period, but then say that that windfall tax has to be at 70%. So in the past, you've recognized that in the future you should pay 30%. You've told your shareholders you would be paid 30%. You've made provisions accordingly in the book. When you change that rate automatically, there is a significant payment that you have not even made a provision for. And so that underlies uncertainty. For the shareholders, uncertainty around where even those funds may come from. That's one. And then two, you have the issue around if we do have to pay these taxes at 70%, what's the base that we're paying it on? Is it the realized amount or the unrealized amount? If we had paid 30% before on some of these gains because they were realized, and you bring on a windfall tax of 70%, you're basically taxing that gain at 100%. So you're taking almost all the gains and not leaving anything for the shareholders or what could have been available for lending in the market. Number three is also the fact that when you have rates like this, it's even the real question around, is it a windfall? Were they actually superfluous earnings that they made? Or these are just normal activities that have occurred and so should not necessarily qualify as a windfall. And so you start to find that questions such as how we even compete against foreign markets also comes up. The truth is, any Nigerian business is poorer than their counterparts in other jurisdictions like the US because the Naira has lost its value. And then to make it worse, there's another layer of tax at 70% or maybe even 100%, as the case may be, that you then put on these institutions. How are they competitive then with their counterparts in other jurisdictions like the US? And then lastly, how does this impact the real sector? Because again, the financial institutions have a cash reserve ratio of 45%. So they must set aside 45% of their cash with the CBN. So you see that the funds that are then left, in this case, 55%, for which you need to then start to lend to the real sector, is shrinking. It's even shrunk. And then you add that tax on it again. This is not perhaps the right time, especially if we want to support industrialization, because we know that that's also closely tied with the inflation that we're also recording, which is at an all-time high. So I think a stakeholder convening definitely needs to happen where we hear from, both sides, and then just start to mediate along the lines of what's in the best interest of the nation at this time. Do we just want a short-term gain in terms of taxes where we tax the supposed windfall, or we want a roadmap that clearly gives opportunities for all that are involved to kind of plan for whatever the case may be, whether it's a windfall, what's the definition of the windfall, what's the base on which those taxes will be made, how does it impact the funds available to the other industries that may rely on these banking industries. And of course, we do want to bridge inequality. And I think the question around the individual earnings that are coming through to the shareholders, perhaps that's where the windfall needs to be. Who are the ultra high net worth individuals that we need to focus on as we start to think more around bridging the gap on inequality? So I think it's a long-faced conversation, not one where you want to just pick on a certain group, but one where you want to be sure that it's really balanced as you prefer solutions. But all in all, I think the government has their head in a good space in terms of raising revenues. It's just it has to be done in a manner that's not discriminatory, but then well thought through.
That takes me to the Presidential Fiscal Policy and Tax Reforms Committee, of course, headed by Mr. Taiwo Yedenle, already has recommended the harmonization of taxes and levies collectible by the 3 tiers of government into about 8 headings or something. That's what we have. But let's just get an access of the workings of this committee, and if properly implemented, what it should be the expected outcome. That's the recommendations.
Yes. So one of the key things that the committee sought to do was to reduce the number of taxes that Nigerian businesses and individuals are burdened with. If you look at the approved list of taxes, you'd find that at every single level, and again, that's also down to the Constitution, every single tier of government has the power to raise taxes. But then again, it specifies what kind of taxes they can or cannot raise. So at the local, the state, and the federal government, you'll have all sorts of taxes coming through. But we then find that we have over 60 types of taxes that businesses grapple with. And that has a telling effect on also the growth of our businesses, because we conducted surveys, and we typically do this for the SME space, where we try to identify some of the challenges for growth. And this is very important, Tolu, because the SME really are the engine of the economy. The world over, SMEs, private businesses, family businesses, they contribute 60% of the GDP of any economy, and they contribute over 50% of the workforce. So it's an important area to focus on. And this is the reason why we do the surveys. One of the things that comes through from the surveys is multiple taxes. And what the committee was also looking to do is to say, how can we address this challenge, knowing where all these taxes are coming from? I mean, a good thing to say we want to raise revenues at these tiers, but then how is it impacting the businesses that will be paying the taxes? And so the bold statement that came through was, we don't want to tax the fruits. We don't want to tax the seeds that are coming in so that it doesn't stop them. But we want to tax the growth that comes through at the end of the day. And so what the committee sought to do was, one, to reduce the number of taxes, to make it a bit more pointed and focused on where we think we can get our growth from, to streamline also the administrative activities and burdens associated with paying those taxes, to come through with raising also the tax to GDP ratio at the end of the day. Because Nigeria, if you ask, on the one hand, some people might say 6%, another would say it's 10%, but we're not where we need to be when we look at our counterparts in other African economies. And so there were things around our VAT rate, for instance, being really low at 7.5% relative to other jurisdictions and economies. But then again, what the committee also did is, what are some of the other roadblocks that we have with VAT? And what you find is we don't really have a true VAT act, because what it means is there's always going to be another hidden cost with VAT. While you may charge VAT at a low rate, because you cannot recover the VAT on your purchases, it means that those become hidden costs for any business, and it piles up. So you might find that for any typical business in Nigeria, their true VAT cost is maybe 20% or more, not 7.5%. And so what the committee was trying to do is to make sure that we align that with international best practice, and we ensured a case where, rather than taxing a few, we're actually expanding the tax nets through the administrative portals that we now create to get a lot more tax revenues from other players in the sector who may seem to be in the informal sector, but they really are formalized businesses, just not reporting the right amounts where we need to collect taxes from. So what the committee has tried to do as well is also think about the ease of doing business. And on that case, we know that a withholding tax regulation has come through with an effective date of 1st July, although that hasn't been gazetted, so the date may change. But what that sought to do as well is to also ensure that withholding taxes, which is an advance payment of income tax, could also be a lot more measured. We find that most businesses face withholding tax rates, for instance, as high as 10%. And wholesale traders in that sense, and not maybe resuppliers, but then a lot more clarity and alignment with international best practice. So all in all, I think the committee really did an excellent job. I think it was very diverse and inclusive because you had the public sector and the private sector chiming in. And what that means is we have had a lot more time to think through what the pain points have been and to come up with realistic solutions as opposed to maybe a one-sided solution that may be pushed by one stakeholder. What I think now needs to be done better is in terms of the introduction of new taxes, how do we ensure that we don't go overboard the 6 or the 8 major taxes that we've come through from this committee to say, rather than it being 60, let it be 8. But then in subsequent years, we don't just have surprise bills or surprise taxes that just come up and then we start to pile up more taxes again. That reduces the ease of doing business in the country and not somewhere we need to be at.
Honestly, the conversation is getting so interesting and time is well spent. Oh, before I let you go, I will ask you this, a 2-in-1 question. Just last week, the Minister of Finance and Coordinating Minister of the Economy says government will give tax breaks again to companies that employ more staff. This is aimed at fighting inflation and, of course, growing the economy. I would ask you that vis-a-vis the president's speech where he says revenue has also improved. 9.1 trillion naira is what we've been able to put together for the first half of the year. Putting all of this side by side, how would you measure the efforts of the fiscal side to help complement whatever is happening on the other side? You know where I'm headed.
Yeah, so I think it's a welcome development where the government is looking to give tax breaks to companies that employ more staff. That's really good. And I think government has really been trying to do that for a long time. Would it curb inflation? Maybe not immediately. So that may need some time before it sets in. I think the question is, where is the inflation coming from? And we've seen things around food inflation being as high as 40%. We have with utilities over 24%, and that's coming from your energy cost as well. And all these have a direct impact on the supply chain and even your food insecurity, which we're grappling with. These are the direct impacts that we have on inflation and the ones that do need to be managed. We've had, of course, the direct offset being that a lot of our youth are unemployed and need to be employed. But then when we do employ them, it's how do we pay them? How do we retain that staff? And how do we also make sure that these pressure points coming from food inflation, we can recover them somehow from the either direct or indirect increase in the cost of goods and services. And that's going to be tough because whilst we have these pressure points, it's not so easy to then translate it into a direct increase in your prices of goods or services. It takes some time to do so. Some companies then need to look at other measures for ensuring that they can still retain their staff and pay them and get this incentive. So the question would be, what kind of incentives will be had? Would it be enough to compensate for all the other setbacks that businesses may have to deal with because they cannot automatically increase their prices? And how do we ensure also that we are using existing agencies where, like the ITF, for instance, and I give this example every time because companies contribute to the ITF 1% of their payroll with the intention that they would be trained and we will have a workforce pool as well that we can tap into. How can we start to also revisit funds like that so that aside from these incentives that may come through from retaining staff, we also get some support from agencies such as that? And then on the last question around the revenues that have increased so far, remember, Tolu, that we have a diverse pool of revenues coming also from the oil sector and the non-oil sector. And the truth is that if we have collected revenues in dollars, automatically when you translate them to naira, it's very high. So you would be recognizing some increases as well because of the dollar arbitrage. But the thing is, you want to measure impact over the absolute amounts. So it's not just about reporting the absolute amount and saying there is an increase. It's also about saying what's the impact on our economy. And this is where we're asking questions around food insecurity, purchasing power of our people. How is the tax revenue also being used? So I think if we look at both, just saying that we're going to give these incentives to companies that employ a lot more staff, and then looking at the increase in revenues and our debt servicing has gone down, it's how do we marry the monetary and fiscal policy together so that the impact on the economy is a lot more felt, as opposed to just, celebrating the absolute increase in those revenues, because some of them really may be coming from the exchange differences.
Siri Agbeyi is a partner with PricewaterhouseCoopers Nigeria. Thank you so much, and it's good to start the week with you. Do have a great week.
You too, Tolu. Have a great one. Thank you for having me.
All right, then. To enjoy your day, well, we'll take a break, and when we return, Viola Kwaga is the head of Open Government and Institutional Partnerships Organization, Budget Foundation. He joins me to continue this conversation around basic efforts of government and impact on the masses. Don't go away. This is Business Now.